Hello again, my name is Courtney. Welcome back to my channel where we discuss educational research one study at a time so that you can incorporate it into your practice. So today we are going to be talking about spelling, and before I get into the actual study, I'm gonna bring out my door. If you watched my video on reading instruction, you will know that we had to do some ego checking, and I think that this is going to be similar for a good chunk of us again. So here's my house, here's the door, check your egos, and I'll give it back to you at the end when we can take what we've learned humbly and put it into our practice, hopefully. So the reason why I was interested in exploring a little bit more about spelling is because I was really reflecting on that article about reading. So if you didn't catch that video, I will link it here or here. I'm not quite sure which one it is. I think it's this one maybe, here. So that you can catch yourself up on that. But basically it was talking about how learning phonics and sounding out words is really important to reading, contrary to current popular assumptions. And so I was thinking, well, if sounding words out and phonics is so important, wouldn't spelling be important too? Because you kind of need to know how to spell words to read them. I don't know, it took me down a rabbit hole of wanting to learn more about spelling. Where I am from, there is sort of this idea that formal, direct instruction, systematic instruction for spelling isn't useful. It's not a good use of time because students can learn spelling other ways and it's not meaningful. And so this study is really looking at that mentality. So there's two schools of thought. One is spelling is caught, which is students will learn spelling incidentally. The other is spelling is taught, which is that you need to do direct instruction in order to really enhance students' spelling abilities. This meta-analysis was intended to evaluate the claim that spelling is taught is inefficient and ineffective. So they're trying to take a look at that idea, the idea that if you spend your time formally teaching spelling, that it's not an efficient way for students to learn and it's not an effective way for students to learn. So the researchers were trying to decipher whether or not this was true. And the way that they did this was through a meta-analysis. Love a good meta-analysis, as we talked about before. And this one is called, Does Spelling Instruction Make Students Better Spellers, Readers, and Writers? A Meta-Analytic Review. So this article is quite intense to read. It took a while to get through. Because it is a meta-analysis, it was really heavy into the quantitative analysis of all of the studies that they used. This study was really interesting. Again, because it's a meta-analysis, it's a study of studies, and the authors did their homework. Oh my goodness. The authors were very systematic and they had a very robust inclusion and exclusion criteria for all of the studies that they were looking at. In their initial search, they yielded 15,000 studies that talked about spelling, and then they used their inclusion and exclusion criteria based on the title and the abstract, and that's very common practice. That's why research studies have such boring titles, is because people need to know exactly what it's about. And so they looked at the title and the abstract, whittled it down, and even in cases where they weren't quite sure about what the research was about, they contacted authors to really make sure that they were meeting the criteria that they had set out for themselves. So they eventually whittled that down to 53 that met their inclusion and exclusion criteria for this study. Of the 53 studies that the authors used in this meta-analysis, the participants that were covered in each study ranged from kindergarten to grade 12. The studies also focused on students that were primarily in typical classrooms as opposed to students that were in remedial education or special education. Some of the studies did focus on students who struggled with literacy, but the authors didn't define specifically what that struggle was. They did comment though on it in their findings. All of the studies had spelling instruction in English, and so English of course has some interesting ways of spelling words. And so that might be important to consider as you're watching this. The authors only looked at studies that were true experiments or quasi-experiments. So they weren't looking at qualitative research studies or correlational studies. They were only looking at true experiments and quasi-experiments in this meta-analysis. In order to make sense of what they were looking at, the authors used 8 research questions to guide their work. One of the research questions that they looked at yielded quite a bit of information, and so they ended up splitting it into 3 sub-questions. So they kind of have 8 plus 3 research questions that guided the findings of this study and helped to categorize what they were looking for and what they found. The first research question was, does formal instruction produce greater spelling gains than no spelling instruction? The answer to this was yes. It was more pronounced from kindergarten to grade 2, but more formal instruction did produce greater gains for students compared to no spelling instruction or compared to like unrelated instruction, which was used in some of the studies instead. So all of the studies had positive effects that formal instruction was superior to having no spelling instruction in terms of the gains that students made in their spelling ability. Question number 2 was, does formal instruction produce greater spelling gains than less formal instruction? So the amount of instruction that teachers are given. The answer was yes. An increase in instruction led to an increase in spelling performance for students, and this was a statistically significant finding. Research question number 3, does formal instruction produce greater spelling gains than spelling is caught approaches? So 87% of the studies, which covered 1,633 students, and they ranged from kindergarten to grade 12, showed that formal instruction is superior to the spelling is caught approaches. So the spelling is caught approaches included teaching reading, writing, and phonics. So it was definitely advantageous for students to have formal instruction. The authors also noted that a student who would be in the 50th percentile would move to the 67th percentile if they received direct systematic teaching about spelling. So that's pretty significant. All you have to do is teach kids how to spell and they'll learn to spell, which I find it interesting that we strayed from that. Okay, question number 4 is, does formal instruction produce gains in students' correct spelling in writing? So a lot of the criticism about spelling is that you can give them a test, they can memorize it for a test, but when they actually come to write it out in their work, that it's not going to make a difference, or it doesn't seem to transfer for them. So the authors looked at this, and unfortunately there were only 6 studies that focused on this. But of those 6 studies, 5 of them had positive effects. So it sounds like a small number, but the data also showed that there would need to be 76 missing studies that the authors didn't come across in their meta-analysis to call the positive effect of what they found into question. So what they found was that an average student would move from the 50th percentile to the 83rd percentile if they're given direct instruction about spelling in terms of it transferring into their writing, that's a big jump. 50th to the 83rd percentile from formal instruction, and it transfers into their actual writing in practice. The authors note that it's important that students can spell properly in written papers because evaluators tend to mark students lower even if their work is really well organized, well planned out, well written. It just has a bunch of spelling errors. So it is to a student's advantage to have better spelling transfer over to their written work. Now, the authors also want to be clear, though, that this doesn't mean that correct spelling on a test will always transfer over to a student's written work, but the prevalence overall is increased if direct instruction is given. The authors also explain that more research in this area is needed. So if you are an educational researcher, this might be an area for you to focus on. Number 5, does formal instruction produce spelling gains that are maintained over time? This one is really interesting too because there's a lot of ideas circulating around about how they might learn it for the test and then they'll never remember the words ever again for their spelling. So to answer this question, the authors had 6 studies that were available to them, and it ranged from kindergarten to grade 3 in terms of the grades that were covered. The findings showed that the gains that students made in their spelling ability were maintained over time. But the authors did show that students were able to remember the words that they were supposed to spell over a period of time lasting from 1 week in some studies to 6 months in other studies, and this finding was statistically significant. Question number 6. Does formal spelling instruction enhance students' phonological awareness? To answer this research question, the authors looked at studies which, when combined, would have included 388 students ranging from kindergarten to grade 1, which makes sense. You don't really teach phonics past grade 1. Students know the alphabet and all the sounds that the alphabet makes past that. So I know it doesn't sound like a huge grade span, but it doesn't need to be a huge grade span. In all but one study, formal spelling instruction did increase phonological awareness, and a student who starts off in the 50th percentile would move to the 70th percentile with formal spelling instruction. Question number 7. Does formal spelling instruction enhance students' reading skills? So to answer this research question, 20 studies were included that focused on this, and combined within those 20 studies included 1,818 students ranging from kindergarten all the way up to grade 12, and they found that yes, formal spelling enhanced reading performance. This question led to a lot of detail in the findings that the researchers found, and so they split up reading performance into 3 areas. So they talk about word reading, so just reading a word with no context, reading fluency, and then reading comprehension. In terms of word reading, studies focused on students ranging from kindergarten to grade 6, and they had statistically significant results that said that yes, spelling instruction leads to better word reading. In terms of reading fluency, there were 4 studies spanning from grades 1 to 6. There was no statistical significance in this area, but there was research that showed that teachers found, practically speaking, that teaching spelling in a direct and formal way led to an increase in reading fluency. So this one's a little bit murky. There needs to be a bit more research there because there wasn't a statistically significant result. In terms of reading comprehension, studies span from grades 1 to 12, and there was a positive effect, and it was statistically significant. So that's really interesting because if students know how words are spelled, it can help them with their reading comprehension. And this makes sense when you think of how words are categorized. We see this in math, right? Where we have an octagon and we say, oh, oct, that's 8. What other words have oct in it? Octopus. And so knowing how words are spelled and how they're created and how they get categorized that way can help students with their reading comprehension, which is really interesting. The authors are really clear to explain in this area that just because formal spelling instruction is beneficial for a lot of reading performance gains, that it shouldn't replace a reading program or a phonics program. Those are still very important. Question number 8, does formal spelling instruction enhance students' writing skills? So to answer this research question, the authors looked at 6 studies, 3 that had students who struggled with literacy and 3 that had typical classrooms that were studied. And the findings for this were really interesting, not what I expected at all. The authors noted that formal spelling instruction did not enhance students' writing abilities in any kind of statistically significant way, and also not in any practical way that was noted either, unlike in the reading fluency one. So the assumption that I would make is that if you're trying really hard to spell all the time, it's going to get in the way of your working memory, and it's going to get in the way of your ability to actually write something out and be fluent, because you're always trying to stop and remember how to spell a word. But the authors didn't find that through their meta-analysis. So writing continued on just the way that it always had for these students. I thought maybe the reason for this could be that students are just not really worrying about spelling when they're writing. They're just going at it, and maybe they'll edit later or use a spell check or something like that. But the authors have a different idea of what might be at play. The possibility that the authors propose is that perhaps formal spelling instruction took place, but formal writing instruction didn't. So there is more research that needs to be done in that area since only 6 studies were looked at. There are also some limitations to this meta-analysis. So one limitation that the authors explain is that they only relied on experiments and quasi-experiments, and so they weren't looking at correlations or anything like that. The authors also didn't explore the time it takes to run a spelling program versus the payoff that you would get from students, and so that might be something worth exploring in the future. The study also didn't look into different types of spelling programs, so what actually goes into a good, robust spelling program. And then the parting words from the authors are that all of this information about how important spelling as taught programs are, or direct instruction for teaching, doesn't take away from the fact that spelling is caught is still valid as a way to learn spelling. So students aren't going to not learn spelling by reading and writing. It's just that formal instruction produces more gains. It is effective and it is an efficient way to teach students how to spell. So if spelling is the goal that you're trying to achieve for your students and you want them to be good spellers, then formal instruction is a very good approach to start using. There are also gains that students experience in terms of reading, so word reading and reading comprehension. So the main takeaway for this meta-analysis is that the idea that formal spelling instruction shouldn't be taking place in schools, it's a waste of time, is really more of a myth, and I don't know what research it's based on. This meta-analysis certainly shows that there is a lot of gains that can be made through formal spelling instruction. And so it is worth our time as teachers to be implementing spelling into our classes. The majority of the gains are made from kindergarten to grade 3, but they're still felt beyond all the way up to grade 12. And so a program might include more intensive spelling instruction in the primary grades and then less intense instruction as students get older. I will try and find some more studies to figure out what goes into a good spelling program and how we can get the most bang for our buck with spelling programs. But for now, I think a good starting place is to bust out the word list and to help our students start spelling so that they can see gains overall in their literacy. Well, I know that is a lot to take in. Thank you so much for watching. Let me give you your egos back again, because I know if you are like me, you have been told that spelling programs are not effective and that you shouldn't do them, and you're probably wondering why your students don't really do a great job of spelling. Well, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video. I would love if you subscribed and hit the bell button so that you can get noticed every time I make a new video. Don't forget to like this video if you found it useful, and please leave a comment below on any other topics you would like me to cover in this video series. I hope you found today's video useful, and I hope that you're going to be able to incorporate some of what you've learned into your instruction, even if it's just one small step at a time. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day. Bye!